Chapter 1. Life Before the Catastrophe. My life before the tragedy was like that of many others. Ordinary, filled with plans, dreams, and confidence in the future. I lived in a small town where everyone knew each other, where every day seemed predictable, and the future felt as stable as the sunrise. I had a job that, while not highly paid, allowed me to feel secure. I was surrounded by friends and family who always supported me. It seemed like everything was going as usual, and nothing could disrupt this familiar rhythm. I had many dreams. For example, I wanted to buy a house outside the city where I could spend weekends with my family, enjoying nature and peace. I also planned to travel across Europe to see the world beyond my small town. My dreams were simple, but they gave me a sense of purpose and direction. I believed that all of this would surely come true. It was just a matter of time and effort. But, as often happens, life began sending me warning signs long before the irreversible happened. At the time, I didn't pay much attention to them, dismissing them as temporary difficulties or fatigue. For instance, at work, there were delays in salary payments. At first, the delays were small, just a couple of days, then a week, and eventually a whole month. My colleagues started to get nervous, but I tried to stay optimistic, thinking these were temporary issues and that everything would soon get back on track. Another warning sign was my father's declining health. He had always been a strong and energetic man, but at some point, he started complaining of fatigue and chest pain. We urged him to see a doctor, but he brushed it off, saying it was just age and nothing serious. Back then, I didn't realize how important it was to insist on him getting checked. Now, I often think that if we had been more persistent, things might have turned out differently. But at the time, I was too busy with my own life to seriously think about such things. Work, meetings with friends, plans for the future, all of it seemed much more important. I didn't even notice how I started drifting away from my loved ones. We gathered less often as a family, talked less heart to heart. Everyone was busy with their own concerns, and it gradually became the norm. Looking back, I realized that it was during this period that the knots began to form, which later turned into a tangled mess of problems. But back then, I was blind. I believed that life was a straight path, and I was walking it confidently and fearlessly. I couldn't even imagine that a sharp turn lay ahead, one that would turn everything upside down. One of the brightest memories from that time was our last family dinner. We gathered around the big table, laughing and sharing stories from the past. My mom cooked my favorite dish, and my dad cracked jokes as usual. It seemed like it would always be this way, warm, cozy, and safe. None of us had any idea that this was one of the last moments we would all be together like this. After dinner, I went outside to get some fresh air. The night was quiet and starry. I looked up at the sky and thought about how well everything in my life was going. I had a job, a family, friends. I was healthy, young, and full of energy. It seemed like nothing could overshadow this feeling of complete happiness. But, as it turned out, I was wrong. Just a few weeks later, everything changed. At first, it was small troubles that I tried to ignore. Then the problems started piling up like a snowball. And then, something happened that turned my life upside down and forced me to see everything in a completely different light. But more on that in the next chapter. For now, I just want to say one thing. Life before the catastrophe was beautiful. It was filled with light, warmth, and hope. And it was these memories that later helped me, in the darkest moments, not to break down and find the strength to move forward. Because I knew, if I had been happy once, I could be happy again. Chapter 2. The Blow of Fate. Life has a way of lulling you into a false sense of security, making you believe that the ground beneath your feet is solid and unshakable. But sometimes, without warning, the earth cracks open, and everything you thought was stable crumbles into dust. For me, that moment came on an ordinary Tuesday morning, a day that started like any other but ended in a way I could never have imagined. I remember waking up early, the sun barely peeking through the curtains. It was a crisp autumn day, the kind where the air feels fresh and invigorating. I had a busy day ahead, meetings at work, a lunch date with a friend, and plans to visit my parents in the evening. As I sipped my coffee, I mentally ran through my to-do list, completely unaware that by the end of the day, none of it would matter. The first sign that something was wrong came around midday. I was at work, sitting at my desk, when my phone buzzed. It was my mom. Her voice was shaky, almost unrecognizable. "You need to come home now," she said. I could hear the panic in her tone, but she wouldn't explain what was wrong. My mind raced with possibilities, but none of them prepared me for what I was about to face. I left work immediately, my heart pounding as I drove home. The streets blurred as I sped through them, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. When I arrived, the house was eerily quiet. My mom was sitting on the couch, her face pale, her eyes red from crying. My dad was nowhere to be seen. "Where's Dad?" I asked, my voice trembling. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and sorrow. "He's in the hospital," she said finally. "He collapsed this morning. They think it's his heart." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My dad, the strongest man I knew, the one who always had a joke ready and a solution to every problem, was lying in a hospital bed, fighting for his life. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. We rushed to the hospital, the drive feeling like an eternity. When we arrived, the doctors were grim. My dad had suffered a massive heart attack. They had done everything they could, but his condition was critical. The next 24 hours would be crucial. I sat by his bedside, holding his hand, willing him to wake up. Machines beeped and whirred around us, their sounds a constant reminder of how fragile life really is. I kept replaying the last conversation we had, just a few days earlier. He had been complaining about feeling tired, but I had brushed it off, telling him to get some rest. If only I had known. If only I had insisted he see a doctor sooner. The hours dragged on, each one feeling heavier than the last. My mom and I took turns sitting with him, talking to him, hoping he could hear us. But as the night wore on, it became clear that he wasn't going to wake up. By morning, he was gone. Losing my dad was like losing a part of myself. He had been my rock, my guide, my biggest supporter. Without him, the world felt empty and cold. The days that followed were a blur of grief and disbelief. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't think straight. Everything reminded me of him, and the pain was unbearable. But as if losing my dad wasn't enough, life had another blow in store for me. Just a week after his funeral, I lost my job. The company I had worked for was struggling financially, and they had to make cuts. I was one of the first to go. It felt like the universe was conspiring against me, stripping away everything that gave my life meaning. In the span of a few weeks, I had lost my father, my job, and my sense of security. I felt like I was free-falling, with no idea where I would land. The future, which had once seemed so bright and full of promise, now looked bleak and uncertain. I was drowning in a sea of grief and fear, and I didn't know how to swim. But even in the darkest moments, there's a tiny spark of hope. It's fragile and easy to miss, but it's there. For me, that spark came in the form of a simple question. What would my dad want me to do? I knew the answer immediately. He would want me to keep going, to fight, to find a way to turn this tragedy into something meaningful. And so, with that thought in mind, I began to take my first steps toward healing. It wasn't easy, and there were many days when I wanted to give up. But I kept going, one small step at a time, because I knew that's what he would have wanted. And little by little, I began to see that even in the midst of despair, there was still a chance for hope, for growth, and for a new beginning. Chapter 3. Rock Bottom. After losing my dad and my job, I felt like I had been thrown into a deep, dark pit with no way out. The grief was overwhelming, and the uncertainty of my future only added to the weight pressing down on me. I had hit rock bottom, and for a while, I wasn't sure if I'd ever be able to climb back up. The days blurred together in a haze of numbness and despair. I barely left my apartment, spending hours staring at the walls or scrolling mindlessly through my phone. I stopped answering calls from friends and family, too exhausted to explain how I was feeling. The truth was, I didn't even know how to put it into words. It was like a heavy fog had settled over my mind, making it impossible to think clearly or see a way forward. Sleep became my only escape, but even that was fleeting. I would lie in bed for hours, my mind racing with thoughts of what I had lost and what I no longer had. When I did manage to fall asleep, I was haunted by dreams of my dad, vivid, painful reminders of the life we used to have. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, only to realize that the nightmare was my reality. The financial strain only made things worse. Without a job, I quickly burned through my savings, and the bills started piling up. I felt like I was drowning, with no lifeline in sight. I applied for job after job, but the rejections kept coming. Each one felt like another blow, another reminder of how far I had fallen. I started to question everything: my worth, my abilities, even my will to keep going. There were moments when I wondered if it would be easier to just give up. The thought of ending the pain was tempting, but deep down, I knew I couldn't do that to my mom. She had already lost so much, I couldn't bear the thought of causing her more pain. One particularly low night, I found myself sitting on the floor of my apartment, surrounded by empty takeout containers and unopened mail. The room was dark, the only light coming from the glow of my laptop screen. I had been scrolling through job listings for hours, but nothing felt right. I felt like I was stuck in a loop, going through the motions but getting nowhere. That's when I broke down. The tears came suddenly, uncontrollably, and I couldn't stop them. I cried for my dad, for the life I had lost, for the future I no longer believed in. I cried until I had no tears left, until I was just sitting there, hollow and empty. But in that moment of complete vulnerability, something shifted. It was as if the storm inside me had finally passed, leaving behind a strange sense of clarity. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. I realized that I had been holding on to my grief and fear so tightly that I hadn't allowed myself to feel anything else. And while the pain was still there, it no longer felt all-consuming. I knew I couldn't stay in this place forever. My dad wouldn't have wanted that. He had always been a fighter, someone who believed in facing challenges head-on. And if he could see me now, I knew he would tell me to keep going, to find a way to turn this pain into something meaningful. With that thought in mind, I made a decision. I was going to take control of my life again, one small step at a time. It wasn't going to be easy, and I knew there would be setbacks along the way. But I also knew that I couldn't stay at rock bottom forever. I had to start climbing, even if it was just an inch at a time. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in weeks. I cleaned my apartment, threw out the takeout containers, and opened the blinds to let in the sunlight. It was a small step, but it felt like a victory. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was moving forward, even if it was just a tiny bit. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't going to let this tragedy define me. I was going to find a way to turn my pain into strength, to honor my dad's memory by building a life he would be proud of. And while the road ahead was uncertain, I was ready to take the first step. Chapter 4: The First Steps Toward Change. After hitting rock bottom, I knew I couldn't stay there. The realization that I had to take control of my life didn't come as a sudden epiphany, but rather as a slow, steady awakening. It was like emerging from a long, dark tunnel and finally seeing a glimmer of light. That light was faint, but it was enough to guide me forward. I decided to take the first steps toward change, no matter how small or uncertain they were. The first thing I did was create a routine. In the weeks following my dad's passing and losing my job, my days had become shapeless and chaotic. I would wake up at odd hours, skip meals, and spend hours doing nothing productive. I knew that if I wanted to rebuild my life, I needed structure. So, I started small. I set an alarm for 7 a.m. every morning, made my bed, and forced myself to eat breakfast. These tiny acts of discipline gave me a sense of accomplishment, something I hadn't felt in a long time. Next, I reached out to my mom. I had been avoiding her calls, not because I didn't want to talk to her, but because I didn't know how to face her. She had lost her husband, and I had lost my dad. We were both grieving, but in our pain, we had drifted apart. When I finally called her, her voice broke as she answered. We talked for hours, sharing memories of my dad and crying together. It was painful, but it was also healing. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel so alone. With my mom's encouragement, I started seeing a therapist. I had always been skeptical about therapy, thinking it was something only other people needed. But I was desperate for help, and I knew I couldn't do this on my own. My therapist, Dr. Patel, was kind and patient. She helped me unpack the grief, guilt, and fear I had been carrying. Through our sessions, I began to understand that it was okay to feel broken, but it wasn't okay to stay that way. She gave me tools to cope with my emotions and encouraged me to set small, achievable goals. One of those goals was to start exercising. I had never been particularly athletic, but I knew that physical activity could help with my mental health. I started with short walks around my neighborhood, gradually increasing the distance as my strength and confidence grew. There was something therapeutic about being outside, feeling the sun on my face and the wind in my hair. It reminded me that the world was still moving forward, even if I felt stuck. Another step I took was reconnecting with my friends. I had isolated myself in my grief, pushing away the people who cared about me. When I finally reached out, they were incredibly supportive. They didn't try to fix me or offer empty platitudes. They simply listened and reminded me that I wasn't alone. Their kindness gave me the strength to keep going, even on the days when it felt impossible. Financially, things were still tight, but I started taking small steps to improve my situation. I created a budget, cutting out unnecessary expenses and prioritizing the essentials. I also began freelancing, taking on small projects to make ends meet. It wasn't much, but it gave me a sense of purpose and reminded me that I still had skills to offer. One of the most significant changes I made was shifting my mindset. Instead of focusing on everything I had lost, I started to focus on what I still had. I had my health, my mom, my friends, and my determination to rebuild my life. I began to see my grief not as a burden but as a testament to how much I had loved my dad. His absence was painful, but it also reminded me of the values he had instilled in me: resilience, kindness, and the importance of family. As the weeks turned into months, I started to notice small but meaningful changes. I was sleeping better, eating healthier, and feeling more like myself. The pain of losing my dad was still there, but it no longer consumed me. I was learning to carry it with me, to let it shape me without breaking me. Taking those first steps toward change wasn't easy. There were days when I wanted to give up, when the weight of everything felt too heavy to bear. But I kept going, one small step at a time. And with each step, I felt a little stronger, a little more hopeful. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure: I was no longer stuck at rock bottom. I was climbing, slowly but surely, toward a brighter tomorrow. And while the journey was far from over, I was finally moving in the right direction. Chapter 5: Turning Lemons into Lemonade. Life has a way of testing us, of throwing challenges our way that seem insurmountable at first. But it's in those moments of struggle that we discover our true strength. For me, the process of turning my pain into something meaningful didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual journey, filled with setbacks and small victories. But with each step, I began to see that even the bitterest lemons could be turned into lemonade. One of the first things I did was to channel my grief into creativity. I had always enjoyed writing, but I had never taken it seriously. After my dad's passing, I found myself pouring my emotions onto the page, writing about my memories of him, my struggles, and my hopes for the future. It was cathartic, a way to process everything I was feeling. I started a blog, sharing my story anonymously at first. To my surprise, people began to connect with my words. They shared their own stories of loss and resilience, and I realized that my pain could help others feel less alone. Writing became my therapy, my way of making sense of the world. It also gave me a sense of purpose, something I had been missing since losing my job. I began to dream of turning my blog into something bigger, a book, perhaps, or a platform to inspire others who were going through tough times. It was a daunting goal, but it gave me something to work toward. Around the same time, I started volunteering at a local community center. I had always been so focused on my own life that I hadn't given much thought to helping others. But after everything I had been through, I realized how much I needed to give back. I began tutoring kids in math and English, something I had never imagined myself doing. Seeing their faces light up when they understood a concept was incredibly rewarding. It reminded me that even in my darkest moments, I still had something to offer. Volunteering also helped me rebuild my confidence. I had been so consumed by my failures that I had forgotten my strengths. Working with the kids reminded me that I was capable, that I could make a difference. It was a small step, but it was a step forward. Financially, things were still tight, but I began to see opportunities where I had once seen only obstacles. I started a small online business, selling handmade crafts and personalized gifts. It wasn't much at first, but it gave me a sense of independence and creativity. I poured my heart into every item I made, and slowly but surely, the business began to grow. It wasn't enough to replace my old income, but it was a start. One of the most significant turning points came when I decided to honor my dad's memory in a tangible way. He had always been passionate about education, believing it was the key to a better future. In his honor, I started a scholarship fund for underprivileged students in our community. I used a portion of the profits from my business to fund it, and I reached out to local schools to spread the word. The response was overwhelming. People donated, shared the initiative, and even offered to help. It was a way to keep my dad's legacy alive, to turn my grief into something positive. As I began to rebuild my life, I also started to rebuild my relationships. I had been so focused on my own pain that I had neglected the people who cared about me. I made an effort to reconnect with friends, to be present in their lives. I apologized for my absence and thanked them for their patience. Their support had been a lifeline, and I wanted to show them how much I appreciated it. My mom and I grew closer, too. We started a new tradition of having dinner together every Sunday, just the two of us. We would talk about my dad, sharing stories and memories. It was bittersweet, but it helped us both heal. We even started planning a trip together, something we had always talked about but never done. It felt like a way to honor my dad's adventurous spirit, to live the life he would have wanted for us. Through all of this, I began to see that my pain had a purpose. It had taught me resilience, empathy, and the importance of community. It had shown me that even in the darkest times, there is always a glimmer of hope. I wasn't the same person I had been before the tragedy, and that was okay. I was stronger, more compassionate, and more determined. Turning lemons into lemonade wasn't about erasing the pain or pretending everything was perfect. It was about finding meaning in the struggle, about using my experiences to create something good. It was about honoring my dad's memory by living a life he would be proud of. The journey wasn't over, and I knew there would be more challenges ahead. But I had learned that even the bitterest moments could be transformed into something sweet. And with that knowledge, I felt ready to face whatever came next. Chapter 6: Triumph and a New Perspective on Life. The journey from despair to hope had been long and arduous, but with each step, I felt myself growing stronger. The pain of losing my dad and the struggles that followed had reshaped me in ways I never could have imagined. I had learned to turn my grief into strength, my setbacks into opportunities, and my fear into courage. And now, as I looked back on how far I had come, I realized that I had not only survived, I had thrived. The scholarship fund I had started in my dad's honor became one of my greatest sources of pride. What had begun as a small initiative had grown into something much bigger. With the support of the community, we were able to award scholarships to several students each year, helping them pursue their dreams of higher education. Seeing the impact it had on their lives was incredibly fulfilling. It was a way to keep my dad's legacy alive, to ensure that his passion for education continued to make a difference. My online business was also thriving. What had started as a side project had turned into a full-time venture. I expanded my product line, hired a small team, and even started collaborating with other local artisans. It was challenging, but it was also incredibly rewarding. I had found a way to combine my creativity with my desire to make a positive impact, and it gave me a sense of purpose I had never felt before. But perhaps the most significant change was within me. I had come to terms with my grief, not by forgetting my dad, but by carrying his memory with me in everything I did. I no longer felt like a victim of circumstance. I felt like a survivor, someone who had faced the worst and come out stronger on the other side. I had learned to embrace the imperfections of life, to find beauty in the broken pieces. One of the most profound moments of this journey came during a trip I took with my mom. We had finally gone on that adventure we had always talked about, traveling to a place my dad had always wanted to visit. As we stood together, looking out at the breathtaking landscape, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. It was as if my dad was there with us, sharing in the moment. I realized that while he was gone, his love and his lessons were still very much a part of me. When we returned home, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. I wanted to share my story, to let others know that even in the darkest times, there is hope. I began speaking at local events, sharing my journey of loss, resilience, and transformation. It was terrifying at first, but it was also incredibly empowering. I wanted to show people that it's okay to struggle, to feel broken, but that it's also possible to rebuild, to find meaning in the pain. The response was overwhelming. People reached out to me, sharing their own stories of loss and resilience. I realized that my pain had given me a unique ability to connect with others, to offer them hope and encouragement. It was a reminder that we are never truly alone, that our struggles can become a source of strength for others. As I continued to grow and heal, I also began to dream bigger. I started working on a book, sharing my story in greater detail and offering practical advice for anyone facing their own challenges. It was a way to reach even more people, to turn my pain into a source of inspiration. Writing the book was a labor of love, a way to honor my dad's memory and to give back to the community that had supported me. Looking back, I could hardly believe how much my life had changed. The person I was now, stronger, more compassionate, and more determined, was someone I could be proud of. I had turned my tragedy into triumph, not by erasing the pain, but by finding meaning in it. I had learned that life is not about avoiding hardship, but about how we respond to it. The journey wasn't over, and I knew there would be more challenges ahead. But I was no longer afraid of what the future might hold. I had faced the worst and come out stronger on the other side. I had learned to turn lemons into lemonade, to find light in the darkest moments. And with that knowledge, I felt ready to face whatever came next. As I closed this chapter of my life and looked toward the future, I felt a deep sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the love and support of my family and friends, for the lessons my dad had taught me, and for the strength I had discovered within myself. I had learned that even in the face of unimaginable loss, it is possible to find hope, to rebuild, and to create a life filled with meaning and purpose. And so, with a heart full of gratitude and a spirit full of hope, I stepped into the next chapter of my life, ready to embrace whatever came my way. Because I had learned that no matter what life throws at us, we have the power to turn it into something beautiful.